welcome to GBH Amplifies the Bay State Banner. I'm
Should
your
have brought
host,
a
Ronald
notepad
Mitchell,
like you.
publisher and editor of New England's Bay State Banner News. Hello, and welcome to GBH Amplifies the Bay State Banner. I'm your host, Ronald Mitchell, publisher and editor of New England's Bay State Banner News. We're here today at the GBH studio in the Newsfeed Cafe in the main branch of the Boston Public Library here in Copley Square for our State of Black America Forum series. Thank you so much for joining us and our live audience. We are just 200 in our live audience. Yes, we can applaud for that. Yes, we can. Thank you, guys. We are just weeks away from the 250th anniversary of America's independence. And as we approach all the fireworks and celebration, it is easy to get caught up in the celebratory nature of the anniversary and forget all of the struggle and pain that we Black Americans have had to endure over the past 250 years since America's independence. We as a people have had to be resilient in the face of centuries of racism and discrimination. And today we're going to recount the stories of struggle and perseverance that has made up the Black American experience over the past 250 years. For our program today, we are joined with some of America's most prominent Black historians to recount the true legacy of the Black American experience and the true legacy of Black America's 250th anniversary. Before we get started, I want to thank GBH for its role in helping to create and supporting platforms for community voices here at the GBH studios in the Newsfeed Cafe in the Boston Public Library. By opening up this public space, GBH has provided a trusted, visible forum for these discussions that helps to elevate voices that are often truly unrepresented. So thank you, GBH, for your support.
Thank you.
And support of the banner. We can applaud that too. Thank you, guys. So I'm going to start off with my far right. Our first guest today on our panel is Narissa Williams-Scott, the CEO and lead producer of That Child Got Talent Entertainment, a Boston-based production company dedicated to creating impactful stories through immersive learning experiences with film, media, and live events. Her latest project is Echoes of Liberty, a multimedia immersive presentation of Black leaders from the American Revolution and our past. Leaders like Crispus Attucks, who, as everybody knows, was the first person to die in the American Revolution, and that was a Black man. Our next guest is Byron Rushing. Byron is a historian and was the longest-sitting Black Massachusetts state representative. He represented his district for over 36 years in the Massachusetts State House and led the struggle for civil rights in our state and our country and created many programs that we're going to talk about through our state that has helped to elevate African American history and African American people overall. So thank you so much, Byron, for being here.
Thank you.
To my left is Kiara Singleton. Thank you for joining us, Kiara. Kiara is the director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, correct?
Yes.
Yes, Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford. She's the postdoctoral fellow of slavery, colonialism, and their legacy project at Tufts University. And she has been appointed to serve on the City of Boston Commemorative Commission and a special commission on the 250th anniversary of American Revolution for the state of Massachusetts. So thank you so much for joining us. And our final guest is Edmund Barry Gaither, my good friend Barry. And Barry is the Executive Director Emeritus at the Museum of the National Center of African American History here in Roxbury.
Artist.
Oh, sorry. The National Center for African American Artists. Let me say that again. Barry is the Director Emeritus for the Museum of the National Center of African American Artists in Roxbury. Barry was the director for the Museum of the National Center of African American Artists, and as director, he championed the presentation of African American history through African American art and presentations in the museum. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining us today as we celebrate and discuss the celebration of America's 250th anniversary. I want to start off with you, Byron, and ask you, as we approach our country's 250th anniversary, What does this anniversary really mean to Black Americans and Black historians?
I think that it's important to understand that when we talk about the American Revolution, and which is sometimes called the War of Independence, that we understand that it wasn't independence for everybody. That the 250th anniversary allowed some people to be free, but not everybody to be free. So there's no reason for Black people to celebrate the 250th anniversary. Their anniversary comes a lot later, right? Because slavery existed in the British colonies before, and slavery existed afterwards. What is interesting in lots of ways is how African Americans approached that. And I think that that is a good discussion for all of us at this table. That some people approached it by saying we should engage with these people who enslave us, but we should support their work to become free themselves, because maybe they will change their mind.
And allow us to be free as well.
Right.
Extend that freedom to the rest of the country as well.
That's right. And in many cases, those deals were made. Deals were made with African Americans that if they would fight with the Patriots, that they would get their freedom afterwards. And there are actually sometimes when they actually did.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Well, thank you, Byron. I want to move on and talk with Kiera. As the executive director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters, can you share with us the history of the Royal House and Slave Quarters? It is a museum as well. Can I refer to it as the museum?
Yes.
Yes. Share with us the history of the Royal House and Slave Quarters Museum and how important that story is to our American history and Black American history.
Yeah, so the Royal House and Slave Quarters was once almost a 600-acre plantation, and on that plantation, the royal family, who became one of the largest enslavers in all of New England, enslaved over 60 Black women, men, and children over the course of 40 years. There's a lot of information about the Royals. Isaac Royal Sr. grew up in Dorchester. Isaac Royal Jr., his son, inherits the wealth and then goes on to bequeath land in his will to Harvard, which then helps found the Harvard Law School. But what I want to talk about is actually the enslaved people, because there's not that much information about them. But as we're talking about the 250th, there's no way that we can't talk about Belinda Sutton. And now Belinda Sutton is extremely important because she was enslaved by the Royals for a huge period of her life. And then after Isaac dies in 1781, in 1783, she files a petition for reparations, demanding to be compensated for all of the years that that family stole her labor and enriched themselves.
So 7 years after the country's independence, she is suing for compensation.
Exactly.
And that dirty word we say, reparations.
Exactly. And what's important about that is that when we're thinking about this moment of freedom, we also have to think about the fact that, yes, in Massachusetts, enslaved people, there's gradual abolition, so they become free, technically, in 1783. But actually, what does that freedom look like? And what she is saying in her petition is that, she's struggling to support herself, she's struggling with housing, she's struggling with food, she's struggling to support her daughter. And so it allows us to think about the failed promises of freedom for Black people in that period, and then all of the things that they're doing in order to make their own lives better.
And why is that story so impactful and important today as we see a rollback on African American history overall?
Well, I think, her courageousness. You know, it's so important to think about this Black woman who was like 70 years old, give or take, filing this petition and demanding that she be compensated for her labor being stolen, but also it's a recognition of what happened to her, right? So she's not afraid to talk about the history of slavery and what it did to her, but more generally, like what we know that it did to Black families. And I think more importantly that we should in this moment also feel inspired by her courageousness to tell these stories, to tell our history, to put them on paper, to say them loudly, because when you do that, you actually cannot erase history. It doesn't matter what you try to do. Those stories are in the world, they're in the archives, they're in history books, and you can't actually erase it. So I think we should all look to people like Belinda Sutton to speak more loudly about our history so that no one can take it away.
That is an amazing Black history story. So thank you for sharing that with us. And this is an ideal time to turn to our third guest on the panel, Narissa Williams-Scott. Narissa is the CEO and lead producer of That Child Got Talent Entertainment, as I mentioned earlier, a Boston-based production company dedicated, as I said, to the creating immersive, impactful experiences for education. And your current project, Echoes of Liberty, really focuses on the stories of legendary African Americans during the years of American independence as well as since then. So
Yes.
can you share with us the history of that, how the project came about and really what the focus of the project is?
Absolutely, absolutely. It started with wanting to be able to preserve history, preserve the history of those who participated within the war, who fought not only for the Americas, but even a few that fought for the British, and giving them their place in history that is trying to be erased from the books. And this is also a augmented reality series, and so the idea was to create this so that younger people would find it interesting and find history interesting, so that they would be impacted in what regards to learning. I mean, everyone on this dais knows and understands and has read about the history, and these young people don't always have that ability. They have the ability, but they don't always have it in front of them. But you put a video game in front of them and they're all in. And so what I wanted to do was to bridge technology with history so that we could retell the past in a present state that would give something to these young people that they would, even if they're just looking at the entire experience, because it's really cool to be immersed, but at the same time they get to hear. We have actors that are portraying these people. I don't want to call them characters because they were real people.
Historical
They're
icons.
historical figures.
figures, yeah.
And so our first pilot is with Crispus Attucks, Mumbet, Prince Hall, and all of the people that were given something to that revolutionary era. We have a few others, Prince Esterbrook, Poor Salem. We have so many different people that gave something to that era, and we want to make sure that we're honoring them in the present.
Share with us some of the actors who participated in some of the characters that they represent, some of the
Absolutely.
historical characters they represent.
Absolutely. We were blessed and able to bring in Blair Underwood to play Crispus Attucks. We were very, very happy about that. Thank you, Blair. And we also have brought in some local name actors, Jackie Davis, Naheem Garcia, to name a few.
Oh, and what different historians did they represent? I know who did Naheem represent?
Naheem represented Prince Hall, and Jackie Davis represented Elizabeth Freeman, whom we lovingly call Mumbet, even though she was very adamant that that was not her name. Her name was Elizabeth Freeman, and so we honor that.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you. That sounds like an amazing project. And where are folks going to be able to experience that? Where is it available?
Absolutely. We have everything up on our website. It's echoesofliberty.co. And when you go to the website, you will see the different pages. You will go into the experience. You'll see a QR code. You scan it with your phone. You download the app, and then the world opens up. You get to see the TCGT channel, and then from there you get to explore everything about these different portrayals.
And I understand you guys have a partnership as well with the Museum
Yes.
of African American History up
We
in
have.
Beacon Hill. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I went to Dr. Trent. Thank you, Dr. Trent. I went to her and I said, we would like to amplify in Congress with the museum. Would you be partners with us? And she she looked at what we were doing and said, absolutely. And so we're in partnership with the Museum of African American History, with the Secret Society of Black Creatives, with Emerge. We are working with our partners to bring amplification. If you would like to go and see our markers in person, you go to Monuments. We're going to have an interactive map with Emerge so that we place our markers on these maps, and you can find them online and go all over the state of Massachusetts. They're not just going to be online.
Wonderful. Thank you, Narissa.
Absolutely.
I think this is really an important piece to emphasize, and that for a variety of reasons, much of the history that we have been talking about,
The traditional history
Right.
of the revolution
but we
excluded
are
these
lucky
stories.
enough, no, that we are lucky enough to have the actual places. You see, you can walk the ground, you see. So what has not been what has been forgotten is that you can go to the royal estate. Now, they tried to let us forget that. They tried to make the people, even the people who owned the royal estate at the beginning, tried to make us forget that,
what
not
happened there,
talk about it. But it's there, you see. So when people talk about slavery in Massachusetts, we can go take them to Medford and show them where these enslaved people lived.
Absolutely.
And that is very, very powerful. That is very, very powerful.
But I also-
and I want to
And
turn to
we can take you to Mum Bet's grave.
That's right. Now we have a statue of her. We also are working with Nantucket to place something out there for Crispus Attucks, and it's actually getting people into the spaces. That's why we're doing what we're doing. We want people to go there, stand on the ground, represents its howlness, right? So that people are standing there in the same spot that Crispus got off the boat, and he was right there, you know, and it's an experience.
definitely an amazing experience, and I'm excited about that. And I want to turn to Edmund Barry Gaither, who was the director for quite a while of the Museum of the Museum of the National Center for African American Artists. And as the director of that museum, you guys championed the presentation of African American artists and African American history through their art. Why was that so important to you to really elevate those stories and elevate this art?
It's necessary to see yourself as total. Black people need to see themselves representing the sum of what it is to be human. That means the creative dimensions in politics, in music and art, in dance and theater. It means in any arena that members of the human family have made a mark. We should be present, and we should make sure that our mark is amongst them. Doesn't have to be better or worse. There is no group arriving with perfection, but you are obligated to be active in your moment and to be engaged with the issues where you can have an impact. And the record of that is in what's done. So if you look at any particular place, New England, Boston, and you look at what remains as markers of place and what exists as the history of objects, you should be able to find your imprint there. Now, that imprint always has an association with some personalities. So it also means that you have the opportunity to explore some people that you may not have known about and to derive inspiration from that, which is what you can give to your children and to your grandparents if they've gotten old already without all of this knowledge that was at their feet and they didn't know. I think all of that is important, and we people who are in the museum business, we're in the business of objects and places because we are committed to the notion that you can go to a source, that there is something vital that is the residual in these spaces of profound importance. And we want people to come and take part of them. But we also want them to discover what they wouldn't have known if they didn't go on such an adventure. And if you were thinking of that, for example, just in terms of our experience right here, you might think of the independence, War of Independence, the Revolution, and some of the ways that we intersect with that we might not think about immediately. And the person who comes to mind as interesting is Paul Cuffey. Paul
And share
Cuffey-
for the audience, share with us Paul Guffey's story.
Yes, Paul Cuffey ultimately owns a ship line, becomes wealthy, challenges the state on taxation and representation because he was successful enough that the state wanted his taxes. And he starts out a believer in the promise of liberty, but discovers that this is an unfulfilled prophecy and turns his attention to the colonization movement. And actually, his ships leave Westport, just right here on our Cape, with people returning to Sierra Leone in the first quarter of the 19th century. It's a story of hope, of ambition, of frustration, and of reaction. And it says that as a person, he wanted to demand everything any person should have. And that on his delivery of successful commercial endeavor, he wanted to enjoy the dividend. And all of that, all of those are lessons that we need one way or another to inculcate. And we here in New England have abundant opportunities to match these stories with their implications and with the personalities who, for learning purposes, serve as markers, as hinges on which we can hang discussion.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you. That is an amazing story. Thank you. I want to turn to you, Narissa, and ask you to share with us one of the stories from your Echoes of Liberty that's very similar to the Paul Guffey story, but the story of Prince Hall and his ascent and his creation of the Prince Hall Masonic Lodge.
Of the
Can you share
Masonic
with
Lodge.
us your-
Absolutely. So Prince Hall was a leather worker, and we believe that in his leather working, he potentially made the leather straps for the fifer or the drummer. I don't remember the name.
Fife and drum.
Yeah. And so
Fife and drum.
that was potentially his role within the war, but he began to get into cahoots, as we say, with Phyllis Wheatley and others who were educated black people. And he began to learn, he learned how to read from his being enslaved. He still learned how to read, he learned how to write, and his goal was to emancipate the minds of the black people, of the enslaved. And he wanted them to understand and to feel, in my opinion, that they were free here first, and then they became free physically. And his idea of creating the Masonic Hall was he was having meetings up on Joy Street, up at the where the museum sits today. And in having those meetings, they also had some down in Faneuil Hall, in the backs of bars and things of that nature. And they were working to figure out a way to free the people, the black enslaved people in this area. And so what he would do in these meetings is he would also talk about the Masons and how the Masons, what they were doing, not only to build in the new world, but to also educate themselves as well. And he petitioned the British government to, or the British Masonic Lodge, to receive a marker, and they kept turning him down. Time after time, they turned him down. Then finally, I assume he probably just got sick of it, and he said, "You're gonna have to tell me to my face." And so he got on a boat and he went. It took him 2 years to get over to England to get his marker, but he got it, and he came back, and that is where the first African lodge started, right here in Massachusetts.
That's an amazing story. Amazing story.
Amazing man.
Yeah, amazing man. I want to move over to Kiera. Can you talk to us about some of the other stories about the enslaved individuals who were enslaved at the Royal Slave House and quarters, Royal
Yeah.
Slave Quarters? And
Yeah, so we know the names of around 60 Black women, men, and children. I think one of the things that's really important is that sometimes when we're talking about African American history, when we know a name, when we know, their history, they become the focus of the story. But I actually think one of the things that's important is that a lot of people who are enslaved, we know their name, but we don't know much about their lives. But they're important too. And so one of the things that we do is that we list everyone that we know. We have a first name or even a nickname, because even if we have a nickname, it's important to mark that they were there, that they worked there, they built lives there, they had families, all of the things. One of the people that I'll also talk about, because I think is important and it's connected to Belinda Sutton, is that we also know that she has a son, and her son's name is Prince Sutton, and Prince Sutton fights in the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Yes.
And that's extremely important for a lot of different reasons. One, when we think about slavery and we think about freedom, we're not often thinking about how individuals are moving in and out of systems at the same time. And so for Prince, one of the ways in which that he could secure his freedom is actually through military service. And so he, along with, dozens of other Black men and indigenous men, go and they fight in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so, as we're in this moment, especially when the Bunker Hill Memorial is being targeted to have those, quotes removed, I think it's really important to show how these histories exist beyond the memorial. The memorial is extremely important, and that these histories are so interconnected with other institutions in and out of Boston. And so for me, when you think about that story and then you think about it connected to Belinda Sutton, I mean, it's quite miraculous, right? So he's one story. Another story that I could share, I think briefly, when it comes to the enslaved people on the plantation is, again, not necessarily putting it's not just one story, but it belongs to all of them. So a part of how we have reinterpreted the site is through archaeological evidence. And some of those pieces of evidence that we have are game pieces. And we know that those game pieces were found directly in front of the slave quarters, where if you were in the big house, you couldn't see what they were doing. And so it's also a reminder that even on a plantation, people are playing, they're spending time with their children, they're, fighting to escape the surveillance of the royals. And, to me, that's a powerful story, right? That they work the land,
Resilience.
exactly.
Yeah.
Resilience.
And so I think that these stories help us kind of build out the world of Black people, and that's really important. It's about the world that they create, both on the plantation and off of the plantation.
And it's so impactful to understand the depth of humanity that African Americans at that time demanded and saw to come to fruition despite all the obstacles that they faced. Byron, when you were at the State House, you helped to create various different sections of our state to create monuments to African American history. Can you share with us a little bit about the Roxbury State Heritage Park and other things that you helped to create when you were in the State House?
Well, it was very important for us that when the state invested in history, that history not only be white history, that it invested. And so a former governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, came up with the idea that we should be telling the history of white working class people. And he wanted to have histories in each city, a mill city of those people. And they would call these heritage parks. And I went to him and I said to him one day, I said, look, I went down this list of heritage parks, and there's one in Lawrence, one in Lowell, and one in Holyoke. I don't see any in Roxbury. And he said, and about a year later, we passed legislation to establish the Roxbury Heritage Park. And the Roxbury Heritage Park still exists. It's a park that is devoted to telling the whole history of Roxbury. We tried to do something that has been done to us and we didn't want to do to them, and that is to tell a history and leave out black people. So we wanted to tell a history and still not leave out white people, because of course there are white people in Roxbury. And we, in Roxbury Heritage Park, tell that whole history from the very beginning, and now just beginning to include the history of indigenous people in Roxbury who were there when white people first came around, around 1630.
So,
May I put a footnote to that?
of course, please.
You know, the concept that Byron put forward for the Roxbury State Heritage Park was unusual in a couple of ways. Most of the heritage parks were built around old industrial areas which had gone into dilapidation.
Like Lawrence,
Old
Mill
mills,
City, like those.
those kinds of things. So the concept that he put forward was that all of Roxbury would be the park. That Elliott Square, as the oldest place there, would be the hub. That there would be non-contiguous sites that, almost like a wagon wheel, would connect to that hub and knit together across space, so that this sense of incorporation and ownership, which Byron was mentioning last, would be physically expressed in how all of the areas were encompassed in the same geography. It was a magnificent way of thinking about the space. It was a generous way of thinking about the space, and it was an achievable way of thinking about the space had the whole will been there to do it. So I think of it still as one of several unfinished tasks that have been taken on in our communities that we should not give up on, because they still have the possibility to make futures that are fruitful for us.
And I thank you for that, Barry. And because to get back to the 250th anniversary, I mean, one of the things about the 250th anniversary that we should do is not just tell the story of what we know happened, but tell the story of what we don't know yet happened. And we should use this opportunity, not only to talk about the Declaration of Independence, but to talk about all the things that happened at that time period in this country that needs still to be undone and cannot be undone unless we understand that it happened.
I think there's a real importance to appreciating the amount of dialogue that is required for growth and learning to happen. And to make clear that it's not just a tiny little group of people who make the dialogue. That dialogue is put forward by every active mind that is engaged.
And
Against that background, I wanted to ask Byron if he would make one further expansion for us, because it's more in his pocket than in mine as a topic. I would like him to say something about David Walker, because these questions of independence and 19th century are inseparable from the discussions that were going on about it, whether they were narrowly tailored towards what becomes the United States or towards other possible futures.
Well, I think
explain the backstory for all of us.
right. So Walker was a radical African American who lived on Beacon Hill, was and wrote an appeal to black people. And he wrote an appeal to black people to end slavery, that the only people who could end slavery were black people. And that appeal, when it got into the hands of white slave owners, caused a great deal of, as they would say in those days, commotion. And so the appeal became illegal for black people to read. And black people found that one way of getting that document around to black people was to have sailors take it.
Yes.
And when they got to a port in the South, to then distribute it. And of course, for many of the people they were distributing it to could not read. And so they read it to them at Walker's appeal. And it became one of the first major radical documents out of the black community. And it was certainly a document that Frederick Douglass had in mind when he made many of his speeches to black people.
And that actually brings up my next topic, which I wanted to talk about, which was Frederick Douglass's amazing speech. I believe he gave it in 1852, not sure about the exact year, but early 1850s. And it was known as What to the Negro is the 4th of July.
That's right, which is interesting. By that time, Frederick Douglass had moved to Rochester, New York, was publishing a newspaper, and a group of white, mostly women, abolitionists came and said to him, we would like you to give the speech, the 4th of July speech in Rochester this year. And he said, I will give the speech, but I will not give it on the 4th of July. I will give the speech, but I will give it the day after the 4th of July. And I don't know if it was in that sentence, in that paragraph, that he realized the theme of that speech, because he said, what to the slave is the 4th of July? I think we can still ask that question
Today.
What to African Americans in Boston, with a president who is trying to erase our history, with a Supreme Court that is trying to erase our ability to vote? What is the 4th of July, the 250th anniversary to the African American in the United States today?
That is a great question, and I will ask all of you to answer that. And since you asked the question, Byron, why don't you give us your first answer? And then
My first answer is we have to take seriously how terrible our history has been and how we have been able to overcome it, and that it will not end until we all have engaged in overcoming it.
full effort by all parties
Yes.
involved.
Well,
Keita?
this is simultaneously a call and a challenge. The call is get up and do something. And the challenge is, what is it I should do? That's a dialogue we should be having perpetually in our domestic space as well as our public space. And it should respond to the gravity of these issues on every level, local, regional, national. So when we look at Texas and Florida, which are star examples of retrenchment in our moment, we should realize that those are impactful where we are, that we're not immune to this effort to roll back or replicate in some way the collapse of Reconstruction from 100 years ago. So, I think we should think of it in terms of the call and the challenge and the requirement to be engaged.
I would just like to say that in being raised by a black woman who taught me from the very beginning that I am a resilient child, that those enslaved ships were packed and some didn't make it. Some died of sickness, some died over the bow, some got here and died in the moment. But we're here because those who didn't were resilient. They found a way to stay. They found a way to thrive. They found a way to live. They found a way. They established legacy for us. And I feel that that is something that needs to be taught to the younger people. What is legacy? What is legacy to black people in this country? How are we teaching them what our legacy is? I happen to come from a family of educators, so I was imbrued with this as I grew up. However, how many of our young people are not? When I go into spaces and I teach young children, I always make sure that I'm adding black history into whatever I'm teaching. I could be teaching you how to make a dish, and I'm going to tell you about collard greens and why it was important to eat those collard greens. Not only because they were delicious, but because of the nutrients that were needed, because there were no vitamins, right? And so how are we teaching legacy? What is our legacy? That's how we take this 250 and we reuse it, and so that we can explain to them so that they can take it and move it forward. If we don't move them forward, there will be no momentum. There will be no place. As much as we are adults and as we are fighting, my mother and your generation got out there on streets and fought for us to have the ability to vote. And I wasn't a part of it, but I was told about it. I was educated about it from the real people themselves. And so I feel that my generation, Gen X, hello, and anyone who is below Gen X, it is imperative that we keep this legacy alive.
And that we continue to share that history
That's
with
right.
our people. Kiera?
Yeah, I think so. A few things, and thinking about Frederick Douglass's speech. Throughout Massachusetts, the reading of Frederick Douglass is actually already in process, I think the earliest was maybe a month or so ago, and then it'll go until maybe like September might be the last event, and that's through Mass Humanities. And so I also want to take a moment to amplify. There are a lot of people who are out here doing also the work, and I think when we do that, one of the, Toni Morrison in that speech, in a speech to, I think it's Portland State in 1975, right? She says the real real function of racism is distraction. And so we end up talking about everything that has that racists have done to us and not what we have done in response. And then also how we have built. And so one of the most amazing things is to highlight all of the amazing work that is happening, and that is being led by Black people, led by young people across the country. And I think one of the lessons that we can learn from history is that when we get shut out of education, we build our own, right? Whether we have freedom schools on plantations in the South, and then you come all the way to the North and you get, the first Black school on Beacon Hill. We have always built our own. So we are not waiting around ever. The second thing is, I think you have groups like today that are in Boston right now, Ujima off of the top of my head, that is doing so much work around Black art, around Black economic expansion. At the Royal House and Slave Quarters, we work with Stephen Hamilton, running a program called Reclaiming Our Hands, Reclaiming Our History, and it actually teaches textiles to young BIPOC communities, and it's always paired with a lecture about the history of slavery or the history of clothing. As a historian, I want to talk about slavery all the time. That's what I studied. That's what I got my PhD. That's what I want to do. But maybe 10-year-old or a 12-year-old might not want to do that on their Saturday morning. They might want to come to the museum to make a do-rag, and then while making a do-rag, they end up learning about the history. So I think we also have to remember how to bring people into our historical
Meet them where they
spaces and make it interesting and make it exciting, but also then listen to what they want to talk about, listen to what's important to them, and then, build around that. But some of the most amazing movements have been led by young people, whether that's going to SNCC or to the Black Lives Matter movement, and so I think when we focus on what people are doing, we get rid of that distraction that Toni Morrison is talking about, because we end up talking so much about people taking away from our history that we don't actually end up teaching the history.
The history itself. That's a
Yes,
wonderful point.
Kira.
Barry?
I think this is a good point to remind ourselves of the creative spectrum on which we exist. At the formal end of it are all the institutions that measure intellectual and creative growth in ways that we're familiar with. But part of the legacy that we claim is an inventiveness that's beyond that. If you imagined for a moment the Middle Passage and all of these Africans who don't even speak the same language in the belly of a ship with no real opportunities, and their communication becomes not words, but gestures,
Yes.
snarls,
Yes.
smears, bent language. It's all the same stuff that we call jazz and blues in our own times.
Yes.
It's Bobby Bland with that in the middle of the song. It's the plaintive quality of a Billie Holiday. All of that is the pain of our forebears transmuted into a new kind of gold in the place where we are. The fruit and evidence of our survival is in that very manifested creativity. And it is part of that same spectrum that makes us who we are. And in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we can't find any place on earth not impacted by the artistic and cultural legacy that comes out of that experience.
That's right.
So any place you go, you'll see the young people copying styles and contents that are created out of this historic experience, which we survived by being creative.
That's right.
And I think that that's an important thing for us to remember, because it tells us that not only did we create stuff from which to survive, but we have some obligation to that stuff.
That's right.
And the obligation we have to that stuff is to try and evolve a criticism which makes that stuff accountable to the human suffering from which it arose.
So it is a documentation of the result that came out of that suffering, and we have to continue to tell and present that story. So
Yes,
that
and not sell ourselves short.
That's right.
Right.
Not sell ourselves to what in Lift Every Voice is being lost in on the path to where it is we ought to go. We need to reground ourselves, but not so narrowly.
I remember one of the most prominent exhibits, and a permanent exhibit at your museum, is the tomb of
Yes, so King Espelta
King Espelta.
of Nubia.
Share with us the story of that, because that is an amazing story, and why you chose that to be one of the permanent.
Well, you know, we're always saying to young people, you come from greatness.
That's right.
Your legacy is kings and queens.
That's right.
And the logical question is, where are they? Show them to me. So when we made the resolution to create an exhibition committed to King Espelta, who governed Egypt and Nubia 2,600 years ago, we wanted to create a backdrop against which contemporary producers of art could see themselves within the larger Black global tradition. We wanted to say, if those pharaohs could get this 14-ton sarcophagus created and into this room with no Mac and no other computer,
No forklift.
then that says you ought to be able to top it.
Yeah.
Because if with their meager resources they could accomplish this, then we expect more of you. And part of the reason that you make an exhibition like that is to say, what do you have to say to this? You can't retreat from it and say, I can't. You can only retreat from it and say, how can I? And that's what we'd like to do.
Share with us, and that's an amazing point, Barry. Share with us the various different stories and positive stories that people coming to the Royal Slave Quarters have had. Some of the impactful experiences that you've experienced, or that you've seen people experience in coming and identifying with these stories.
Yeah, I think first of all, people do not expect to go to a plantation in New England. They don't expect to go to Massachusetts in Medford, a very residential area, and then walk onto a plantation. I think that is really shocking.
That in and of itself is,
yeah,
yes.
to people. But then we have one of the only standing slave quarters in the area. We have a slave quarters. The Shirley Eustace Estates does, Marblehead Museum. And so when you think about that and when you put it in the North, I mean, people still
always
associate
assume that
slavery with a Southern story. And then it's also very agricultural. So then they're really confused because they're like, wait, but what's growing here? And I'm like, oh, there's no cotton, there's no rice, but that's how we've told the history of slavery. And when you get to a place like Massachusetts, you need to tell the history of slavery through brick making and shipbuilding and enslaved people working at ports and the restaurants, working in pottery houses. That feels really unsettling. And so a part of, I think, for me, when people come, is just to have that experience, to actually turn what they think they know about the history of Massachusetts on its head. And I think when they then learn about Black people and then all of the ways in which they are resisting, it really creates a powerful moment of connection. One thing that I'll say is that Belinda Sutton's petition is filed on February 14th. That is Frederick Douglass's assumed birthday, right? And then one thing that I'll also say that, so there's intention there. And then there's another thing that I think is also really fascinating when we talk about what is the 4th of July to the slave. Frederick Douglass also does that on July 5th. Well, why is July 5th important? Well, that is an Emancipation Day for Black people in New York. And so when you connect all of these histories, it allows us to think about the ways in which enslaved people and free people were always uplifting one another and always uplifting other freedom movements. So also when you come to the Royal House and Slave Quarters, you know that it's a local story, but it's also a global story because the Royals enslaved people in Antigua, in Suriname, and Jamaica, and Rhode Island, and in Massachusetts. So we are talking about the global experience of slavery. And then why does that matter? Well, one, because it allows us to think about where people are from. One of the other functions of racism is trying to divorce Black people from a past. And we have never allowed that to happen. But then the other thing is that when you get to the 19th century, what are Black people mobilizing around? West Indian Emancipation Day. They're celebrating Haitian independence. Again, these histories are always interwoven and connected. Even in the 19th century, Black people are still identifying as Africans. That is important. And so when we teach this history, when you come to a place like the Royal House and Slave Quarters, you're not just learning about this one moment, you're learning about the ways in which, and I keep saying this about how Black people built a world for themselves, but that world always included the liberation of all Black people.
Could I just also say that I think that it's impactful to understand where, people say, well, where did it begin? When I did a deep dive into Elizabeth Freeman, finding out that she actually, even though she was the first to win in Massachusetts, she wasn't the first to apply.
Yeah.
I found out so much information in regards to that. To know that there were petitions of at least, from what I could find, and I'm sure there were more, but for what I can find, there were like 40. There were 40 Africans who had petitioned the court for their freedom. And it was the most wonderful experience finding out that piece of history. That yes, it may not have been a first name, last name, but it was someone's name was on record in these different towns in Massachusetts because they were like, hey, you're claiming you want to be free, so do I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's powerful. So sometimes it's like when you're thinking about the powerful stories, the uplifting stories, the fact of the matter is that Black people never accepted slavery. And from the moment that slavery exists, there is a history of resistance, that they go hand in hand. And I think that is one of the most powerful things that we can, share with and teach people today, that there is no such thing as slavery without Black resistance.
Yep.
That's right.
And there's no part of American history that doesn't include Black American history.
Exactly.
That's right.
Wonderful. So we are kind of we're coming towards the end of our hour, but I want to give everybody a quick opportunity to just kind of give us a last word, maybe 30 seconds of what you'd like to leave our audience with as we come to the celebration of 250 years.
Well, I'd like to leave it with a challenge again, because we have so much more to do.
Amen.
What has been done is an inspiration and a platform. But the purpose of a platform is to provide a launching pad for the rest of the world. So we need to harness what goes into that launching pad, and we need to propel ourselves towards a future of our own making in the considerations of our humanity.
Thank you. Kiera?
Wow, that's
We can applaud
that's
it.
amazing. I think in accepting that challenge, actually, a part of the work that I've been doing with colleagues at the Royal House, I mentioned artist Stephen Hamilton. I've also been doing research alongside historian Abid Alibai, is to get into these archives and to learn more about all of these people and to do the work. And then it's not only just to, we have a bunch of new research that's going to drop soon, but it's not just getting it out there in the world. It's also showing how to use those archives and to encourage
that
our
information.
communities to go in there, and that they too can study themselves and their families. And in fact, we've always been doing it. That's why we know so much about what we do when it comes to African American history.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, so
Byron,
I do
last
think,
comment?
I do think that the word that has been used here and needs to be used more here is reparations. I do think that in what we owe our ancestors their salary.
Amen.
We owe our ancestors a way for them to get their salary. We own our ancestors a way that wealth that was given to so many white people in 1860, in the beginning of the Civil War, the richest white people were in Mississippi, in this country. We're in Mississippi.
And their wealth came from
And
the
their
slaves.
wealth came from a society that was a slave society. And all of that needs to not only be talked about, it needs to be acted upon, and it needs to be repaired.
Thank you, Byron.
I would just like to say yes. It's kind of hard to come after that one. But I always bring it back to kids, because I'm a teacher and that's what we do. And so I would like to say in my last 30 that find out what came before you, find out what happened to them, around them, for them, against them, everything about them, so that you can develop your own legacy to move it forward and document it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we turn to the anniversary of America's independence, we must remember the true stories of our American history. What really made America great has been the contributions of Black Americans for over 400 years and counting. Juneteenth is Friday, June 19th, and the 250th anniversary of America's independence peaks in July and continues for many months to come here in Massachusetts and all around the country. The best way to celebrate Black history is to encourage everybody to visit and support museums and historical sites celebrating the outstanding people of African American descent around the Commonwealth, including here in Boston, in Medford, Nantucket, New Bedford, and the Berkshires. Take your family on a history tour and discover Black heritage sites in New England and around the state and country. Find out more about the various different opportunities and places to celebrate Juneteenth and to celebrate African American history in this next week's special edition of the Bay State Banner. You have a special section, our special Juneteenth section, and you can get our newspaper at various different drop sites around the city, as well as at baystatebanner.com. You can read the full paper, no paywall available. So, as I always like to remind people, our history, Black history, is American history. And no matter what plaques you remove or what history books you try to ban from American libraries, our contributions can be seen and felt every single day in this country, and they will never be erased or forgotten. So I want to thank our guests for reminding all of us of that fact. I want to thank Narissa Williams, Scott, for joining us, Byron Rushing, Kiera Singleton, and Edmund Barry Gaither. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I also want to thank all of you here today in our live audience for joining us at the Newsfeed Cafe in the main branch of the Boston Public Library. Thank yourselves, and thank you for joining us here. As we wrap up our last show for this season here at the Newsfeed Cafe, I also want to thank the entire GBH production staff and our team along here at the library. Sandra Lopez-Burke, thank you, Sandra. Lauren Herbert, thank you so much. Juan Jose Candea, Steve Barashi, and Maddie Geyer. So I want to thank all of you so much for helping us to put on this wonderful program. Please check with GBH for the third season and the third upcoming season of GBH Amplifies the Bay State Banner. We'll be starting in the fall of this coming year, so definitely check the GBH website and the Bay State Banner website for more information. I am your host, Ronald Mitchell, editor and publisher of New England's Bay State Banner. You can read the banner at baystatebanner.com or over 400 drop sites around the state of Massachusetts. So thank you so much for joining us here on GBH Amplifies the Bay State Banner.